What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the episode of Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Mayalari. So in today's episode, I'm going to give a breakdown of my first mock draft for the 2026 NBA Draft. This is just for the lottery part of the draft, so just picks 1 through 14. Going to give my breakdown of who I have going at each pick. I'll probably do 2 or 3 more mock drafts before the first round of the NBA Draft on June 23rd. So we'll see where we end up at that point. But for now, this will be my first mock draft. I'm sure it'll change over the next few of the mock drafts that I do. But it's fun to try to predict how things will go. We'll start out with the first pick, and that's the Washington Wizards taking A.J. Dembonsa out of BYU. A.J. is the best player in the draft, in my opinion, and I don't think it's even close. He's going to be a franchise-changing talent for whatever team takes him, whether that's Washington at 1 or Utah at number 2. Dembonsa is the best bucket getter in the draft. He can slash and get to the bucket so easily. I think he's a top 15 player day one in the NBA. I know that's high expectations, especially for a rookie, but that's how special I think he is and how special I think he's going to be. I think he's an all-NBA caliber player in year one. When you look at this draft, he is a guy that gets the bucket so well. He can play really good defense, can grab rebounds, has really good athleticism and good size. He's a crafty finisher at the rim, great body control, and can crash the boards. And he's 6'9". At the small forward position as well, like he checks every single box you would want for a guy that's going number 1 in the NBA draft. He has excellent athleticism, gets to the cup so well. One thing he has to improve upon is his three-point shooting. He only shot 33% this past year at BYU. That's something that needs to get better. But at the end of the day, still a very good player. And as I said, I think a generational talent. My player comp for him in the NBA is Giannis. I know that's some really difficult expectations to live up to, but I think he's a very special talent. I haven't seen anybody in this draft class get downhill as easily as AJ, and I know he can develop his three-point shot more, and that's something that can happen in the NBA, hopefully. But he's more promising from the three and outside the arc than Giannis. And at the end of the day as well, he's still really young, just finished his freshman year. He can develop his game more in the NBA. I know it's going to be more difficult competition, bigger and stronger players and faster players around you in the NBA, but I think AJ is going to be a franchise-changing player, and I have him going to Washington, landing in a good situation. There's talent around him. You have Trae Young, you have Keyshawn George, you have Alex Sarr, you got Anthony Davis, Bilal Coulibaly, Bub Carrington. There's a lot of talent in Washington. Dembonsa, if he ends up in Washington, is going to a place where there's a good supporting cast around him as a rookie. And one last thing I want to note, Dembonsa led the country in scoring as a freshman this past year with 25 points per game. He was the first freshman to lead the country in scoring since Trae Young. Now moving on to number 2, I have the Utah Jazz taking shooting guard Darren Peterson out of Kansas. Peterson is an excellent bucket getter and honestly may have the second highest floor on the offensive end than any player in this draft besides A.J. Dembonsa. Peterson could fall in this draft because of significant and valid injury concerns from his freshman year at Kansas. He had cramping issues, which caused him to be hospitalized during the season, which ended up with him missing 11 games during the college basketball season. Even in games he played, he was often on a minutes restriction, essentially a load management situation to make sure he didn't overexert himself. These medical concerns could very much cause him to fall in the draft, but Peterson's ability to create his own shot and score at all 3 levels makes him an elite prospect. He's a combo guard, more of a shooting guard, in my opinion, than a point guard. I think it's a roll of the dice considering his medical concerns, but he could be a 20-point-per-game scorer, so I think it's worth it for Utah, a team looking to get out of their rebuilds phase and try to start contending for a potential play-in spot in the Western Conference. I think Peterson, his ability to score at all 3 levels, is something that is definitely attractive for any team in the top 4. Everybody would want that scoring ability on their team. I did want to take Caleb Wilson here at number 2 for Utah because I think Wilson is the second best player in this draft. But at the end of the day, if you look at that Utah team and all of the big men they have right now, Lauri Markkanen, Walker Kessler, Jaren Jackson Jr., Ace Bailey even, they have a lot of big men on that team, and I know you always want to draft best player available in the NBA draft. You don't want to draft based on need, but I think Peterson fits that team better than Wilson may, especially as a rookie, considering right now, heading into the season, the Utah Jazz do have a lot of guys in their front court, so it would be tough for Caleb Wilson to try to thrive on that team. Now looking at number 3, I have the Memphis Grizzlies taking Caleb Wilson, power forward out of UNC. Like I said, I think Wilson is the second best player in the draft. I think he's going to be a multi-time All-NBA selection and an NBA All-Star for most of his career. He's not going to beat you shooting the ball from 3, but he has the ability to slash and score at the next level. What stands out to me most is his athleticism. His elite upside as a defender as well is going to translate in the NBA, and he's a very good rebounder. He can clean up on the offensive glass better than any player in this draft. This dude is going to be a dunk highlight reel machine at the next level with his long wingspan and elite bounce and a strong motor. He's going to be fun to watch at the next level. This guy can jump out the gym, and I know that's very high praise for him. Just like I gave Debanza really high expectations, saying Debanza is going to be an all-NBA caliber type of player in year 1, and I just said Wilson is going to be a multi-time all-NBA selection and has the ability to be an NBA All-Star for many years of his career. I know that's really high expectations to live up to, but I think he is a very special talent, Wilson, and that's the same in the case of Debanza. These guys are going to be very good players at the next level, and I think their athleticism is what stands out most to me on film, and then you add in their ability to slash and get to the bucket. That's what I want from a prospect, especially a guy I'm taking this high in the draft. I want guys that can score in different ways, and when you have 2 guys that can get downhill better than many players in the draft, Wilson and Debanza, those guys are special finishing at the rim because of their athleticism and their ability to jump. So that's why I have both of these guys going in the top 3. And then at number 4 are the Chicago Bulls taking power forward Cameron Boozer out of Duke. Boozer was consistent all year at Duke as a freshman, and I would not be surprised to see him go number 2 or number 3, but I just don't think his ceiling in the NBA is as high as Wilson or Debanza. Boozer may feel like a safer pick to most than Wilson, but Boozer's game is not as flashy in my opinion, which I know flashiness doesn't always equate to winning at the next level and succeeding at the next level. Boozer likely has a higher floor than Wilson, I'll admit that, but I think Wilson ends up with more all-star appearances over his career. Boozer is not as quick as other prospects and isn't as good of an athlete as Debanza or Wilson, for example, but Boozer can do the little things that add up to wins. He's a strong passer, strong IQ, could shoot the 3 and space the floor. I could be very wrong, but I think Boozer ends up being a good player in the NBA, but not elite. And I'll say it again, I could be wrong, and he could end up being a very elite player at the next level. And that's the same with a lot of these players. Some predictions of mine may be right. Some may be wrong. No one knows how these players are going to be at the end of the day in the NBA. But I'm giving my opinion based on today and how I think these guys will perform as a rookie. And then obviously 4 years to come. At number 5, I have the LA Clippers trading down from 5 and trading down with the Brooklyn Nets. The Brooklyn Nets currently have the 6th pick in the NBA draft. I have the Nets trading up from 6 to 5 with the LA Clippers to take shooting guard Darius Acuff Jr. out of Arkansas. I have Brooklyn trading up here from 6 to 5 because right now there are many reports that Brooklyn and Sacramento are really interested in getting Darius Acuff Jr., and there are probably trade talks going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. And with this trade, I am presuming that the Brooklyn Nets and Sacramento Kings are both trying to trade up to get Darius Acuff Jr. And in this deal here, the Brooklyn Nets offered a better package to the Clippers to trade up from 6 to 5. So I have them taking Darius Acuff Jr., as I said, out of Arkansas. Acuff rose up the ranks in 2026 for the NBA draft after a very strong year at Arkansas. He's an absolute stud talent on the offensive end, can create his own shot at an exceptional level. He reminds me of a mix of Norman Powell and Damian Lillard. Acuff can score at all 3 levels, is very good shooting off the catch, and is crafty with his dribbling. He has shown the ability to make tough shots on his own without being assisted, and this is a quote per Sports Illustrated. He had a whopping 75% of his at-rim shots were unassisted, 80% of his mid-range shots were unassisted, and 40% of his threes were unassisted, which just proves that this guy could score at all 3 levels, and at all 3 levels while creating his own shot, which is very important at the next level. So I have Brooklyn going out and getting a supreme offensive talent at number 5, and then I have the Clippers now moving down to number 6, and I have them taking Keaton Wagler, a point guard out of Illinois. Wagler is a legitimate 3-point threat, shot 40% from 3 this past year at Illinois. He's also a playmaker in the pick and roll, which is tough to pass up for the Clippers. The Clippers are currently in a rebuild or a retooling phase. over the last 3 months or so, which has honestly gone perfectly. They landed a top 5 pick. They got Benedict Mathurin in a trade with Indiana. He's now a restricted free agent. We'll see what they do there. They got Isaiah Jackson in a trade with Indiana as well in that Ivica Zubac trade. They also got Darius Garland, a 2029 Pacers first-round pick, and 2 second-round picks in exchange for James Harden and Ivica Zubac, both of those being in trades with Cleveland and Indiana. This midseason pivot from Lawrence Frank and the Clippers front office likely put the Clippers in the best spot to contend sooner than most teams would have in a rebuild or a retooling phase. The main question right now for the Clippers is whether or not they keep Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi is a top 5 player in the game still, even at 34 years old. He was just a second-team All-NBA selection. I thought he should have been first-team All-NBA, but at the end of the day, I'm happy he was second All-NBA. Will the Clippers decide to maximize a return on Kawhi Leonard when his value is highest, coming off a season where he's mostly healthy? That's a big question mark. I think it comes down to what Kawhi wants. If Kawhi is fine with being traded and is willing to go elsewhere, the Clippers, I do think, will move him. If he wants to stay in LA and try to go for one last run, which it won't be an easy run, especially considering how good the Western Conference is, if he wants to go for one last year in LA just to see how things end up, and he is on an expiring contract, maybe the Clippers roll the dice and try to go one more year with Kawhi Leonard on their roster. I still think Kawhi Leonard is a top 5 player in the NBA, especially when healthy. We saw Kawhi Leonard score 20-plus points in 50 straight games this past season, so he obviously shows the ability to still be a top talent in the NBA. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in the trade market for him. I think teams like Detroit, Houston, Miami could all be interested in Kawhi Leonard. So I do think the Clippers will listen to offers, but I think it ultimately comes down to what Kawhi wants. If the Clippers decide to go all in with Kawhi, there is a chance they take this 5th pick and trade it for something, but I don't think that would be the best move. I think the best move in that case would be if Kawhi Leonard wants to stay, they want to win with Kawhi, or at least try to contend for this next season with Kawhi, start the year with Kawhi on your roster, and then take somebody here at the 5th pick, or in this case, with them trading down, the 6th overall pick. I think Kawhi Leonard, with him being on an expiring contract, it kind of forces the Clippers' hand to potentially try to trade him. I'm not sure if they will try to extend him, especially at 34 years old. We'll see what happens. But Wagler is reportedly a main target here for the Clippers with this 5th, or in this case, like I said, the 6th overall pick after this trade down, which, as I said, is a hypothetical trade here between Brooklyn and the LA Clippers. I would not mind a trade down again here from the 6th overall pick. I think Cameron Carr is a guy that's going to be at the bottom of the lottery picks here in the 2026 NBA draft. And if you can add an elite athlete in Cameron Carr to this lineup, I think that would be huge, but I don't see the Clippers trading down again. I have them taking Wagler here at 6 overall, which at the end of the day, we'll see what happens with Wagler and Darius Garland. I don't think at the end of the day you should ever try to take a pick in the NBA based on need. So that's why I have the Clippers taking the best player available here. And right now, it seems like Wagler is the guy that the Clippers are most interested in. But I do think Cameron Carr is the most underrated player in this year's draft. I'll talk a little bit more about him as we get to the bottom of the lottery. At number 7, I have the Sacramento Kings taking Kingston Flemings, a point guard out of Houston. Flemings is an elite defensive player and is a strong playmaker for the rest of the offense around him, which is something that's very needed in Sacramento. They need more defense and they need more playmaking. And I know the NBA draft is typically best player available, but Flemings also fits a need here in Sacramento. They have a ton of offensive potential with Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, Domantas Sabonis, and Malik Monk, but they don't have enough defense. And they also don't have enough playmaking around those guys to succeed. They need a point guard that can distribute and create shots for guys around them, and that's what Flemings can do. He's quick. He's a strong athlete. He's listed at 6'3", which some people may see as a weakness, but his aggressive defensive play could translate to the next level, even at 6'3". I like this pick here for Sacramento. At number 8, I have the Atlanta Hawks taking LeBaron Philon Jr., a point guard out of Alabama. He's a combo guard with the potential to be a legitimate 3-level scorer in the NBA. He has great speed, which can make him a difference maker in the league. The Hawks need a guy who can step in and be a bucket getter, which Philon could do for them. We saw in that Knicks-Hawks series in the first round. that the Hawks needed somebody that could be a go-to guy in a big situation. They didn't have Trae Young anymore to create his own shot in a big moment. They could go out and get that in the draft here with the 8th overall pick, and that's why I have them taking Philon Jr. out of Alabama. At number 9, I have the Dallas Mavericks taking Nate Ament, a small forward / power forward out of Tennessee. He's a 6'10 forward with a 7-foot wingspan. He had a lot of ups and downs this past year at Tennessee, so it's tough to know where he will go in the draft. It could be in the top 10. It could be towards the end of the first round. No one really knows right now. Ament did average 17 points per game this past year for the Vols, but he only shot 40% from the field, which is somewhat concerning considering there are a lot of good scorers in this draft and a lot of guys with better shooting percentages and better shooting splits than Ament had this past year at Tennessee. But he's very capable defensively. With that being said, I think he can improve on the defensive end. He's a true roll of the dice, a boom or bust prospect, I would say, but he has great potential if he develops his game. I know that's the case for every player in this draft, though. Every player is essentially a roll of the dice based on how they're going to perform at the next level, how they develop. We'll see what happens, but I have Ament going here at number 9. At number 10, I have the Milwaukee Bucks taking a point guard, Michael Brown Jr. out of Louisville. The Bucks are in the midst of figuring out their direction, whether that's with Giannis Antetokounmpo or without him. Either way, they will need to get this draft pick right. This past year, Brown averaged 18 points, 3 rebounds, 5 assists for the Louisville Cardinals. Brown is elite in the pick and roll, which can translate at the next level. Also, he's 6'5", which can help him create his own shot. There is concern with his lingering back issue, which I think will cause him to drop in the draft a little bit, but I think he's a good pick here for Milwaukee, and they do need a point guard as well to control that offense. At number 11 are the Golden State Warriors taking a power forward / center in Yaxel Lendenborg out of Michigan. The Warriors need help in the interior. Draymond Green is only getting older, and Kristaps Porzingis is a free agent. Taking Lendenborg here is definitely a possibility for Golden State. He averaged 15 points, 7 rebounds, with 2.3 stocks per game on a championship Michigan team this past year. He can also stretch the floor for the Warriors. He shot 37% from 3 this past season, off 4.5 attempts per game from downtown, so he could fit well into Steve Kerr's offense. Steve Kerr is now back on a multi-year deal. I know I said before the playoffs began that I thought Steve Kerr would be retiring after this current season ends, but he will be back on a multi-year deal, and I do think Lendenborg here could be a good pick for them because he can fit well into their offense, considering he can space the floor for that team and shoot the 3. At number 12, I have the Thunder taking Ade Mara from Michigan. He is a center who is 7'3" with a 9'9" standing reach, second best in combine history. He averaged 12 points and 7 rebounds with 2.6 blocks per game this past year for Michigan. He's an elite shot blocker and shows potential as a facilitator as well, but he struggles with mobility and free throws, which can be a concern for teams. I think he could be a good potential low-end starter in the NBA or a good depth piece as a center off the bench. At number 13, I have the Miami Heat taking Dalen Swain, a shooting guard / small forward out of Texas. Swain could very well be the steal of the draft at this point if he falls to 13. He has elite athleticism, is explosive, and can slash to the bucket very well, which is something that I've noted now I'm a big fan of. I'm a big fan of guys that can create their own shot and get to the bucket. Swain should be higher than the 13th overall pick, but a lot of mocks have him going somewhere in the 20s. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think he's better than the 25th overall pick. That's why I have him going here at 13th. I know that's a stretch, but I think he's a very underrated player, just like the guy I have going at 14th overall. I'm a big fan of both of these guys, and I think they have higher ceilings than their current draft projections. I think they're both being underrated. And now with the 14th overall pick, the guy I was just mentioning there with Dalen Swain, as I said, Swain and this guy who I have going 14th are both very underrated and I think have higher ceilings than their current draft projection shows. And that's Cameron Carr. I have him going 14th overall, a small forward / shooting guard from Baylor. I have him going to Charlotte here at number 14. Cameron Carr, I think, will be rising up draft boards in the coming weeks. He has unreal athleticism. He's a dude that can really jump out the gym. He reminds me of Zach LaVine mixed with Trey Murphy III. This dude is my third best prospect in this draft. I have Debanza, I have Wilson, and then Carr. I know that's very much high expectations to place on Carr and is a lot of high praise as well. But I think this kid has star potential written all over him. I know a lot of people are projecting him to be a potential role player off the bench at the next level, but I think this guy can be a lot better than that. And I could be very much wrong, and he ends up being a good role player at the next level, but isn't necessarily a star like I'm projecting him to be. But I watch his film. I see a star in the making. I see elite athleticism and a guy that can really jump out, especially a guy that can clean up on the boards, can really slash as well and finish at the rim. I think he could be the steal of the draft at number 14. I have him going here to Charlotte, a team that made a great stride this past year after taking Colin Kneppel in the 2025 NBA draft. They took a major stride and were a play-in team this past season, or I should say this current season, since it's still going, with Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals happening tonight. That's going to be very exciting, but I don't want to get too much off topic here. But in this past season or current season, Charlotte did make a lot of major strides, and if you can add a guy like Cameron Carr, who I think at first will be a bench scorer for them considering their current lineup, but I think down the line could be a focal point in their offense, I think it's a good roll of the dice here for them at number 14. And I did just mention Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals. I think that's going to be a great matchup tonight at 8 o'clock. Oklahoma City will be hosting San Antonio. I think Oklahoma City ends up winning that game tonight. I think it's going to be a very close one. Should be an epic battle. I just think Oklahoma City's ability to win games with Shea even struggling at times shows how deep of a team they have. They've had a lot of guys step up in the playoffs, and I expect that to be the case tonight as well. And I expect a good game from Shea and Wemby as well. It should be a really exciting matchup, but I do have Oklahoma City winning Game 7 tonight. And one last thing I want to talk about before I close the episode is the NBA's new anti-tanking rules, which will be put in place for the 2026-2027 season. The NBA Board of Governors just passed a new anti-tanking system, which I'm going to break down how it's going to change the NBA draft lottery, which right now, for the current system, which we can say for the 2026 NBA draft, teams with the worst record from 2026 and most drafts before 2025, 2024, 2023 down the line, teams with the worst record had the best chance at the number 1 overall pick or a top 4 pick. That won't be the exact same now in the future. It'll be very much different. The current system was that the team with the worst record had a 14% chance at the number 1 overall pick, a 40.1% chance at a top 3 pick, and a 100% chance at a top 5 pick, with a 0% chance at a pick that falls 6 through 12. That'll be completely different now with this new anti-tanking system. The team with the worst record will now have only a 5.4% chance at the number 1 pick. They'll have a 16.4% chance at a top 3 pick, a 28.4% chance at a top 5 pick, and a 71% chance at a pick that falls 6th through 12th. We'll see what ends up happening, but this seems like a very aggressive approach by the NBA. And this new lottery proposal, they're calling the 3-2-1 draft lottery, which at the end of the day, this is why they're calling it 3-2-1. It's based on the amount of lottery balls that each team will get. So now there will be 16 teams in the lottery with flattened odds. It used to be 14 teams in the draft lottery. Now there will be 16, which will flatten the odds for each of those teams. And the reason why they call it the 3-2-1 proposal is because of the amount of lottery balls that each team's going to get. So bottom 3 teams will now have 2 lottery balls. Teams that are 4 through 10 will have 3 lottery balls, and then play-in teams will have 1 or 2 lottery balls depending on where they fall in the play-in tournament. There are a few other stipulations as well. Teams cannot pick number 1 in consecutive years. They can also not pick top 5 in 3 consecutive years. So this is a very aggressive approach by the NBA. Like I said, the teams with the 3 worst records in the NBA will now only have a 5.4% chance for each of them to land the number 1 overall pick, while the remaining non-play-in teams, which will be 7 teams that fall from the 4th worst record to the 10th worst record, they will each have an 8.1% chance at the number 1 overall pick, while the 9th and 10th play-in seeds will have a 5.4% chance at the number 1 overall pick, and then the losers of the 7 versus 8 play-in games will have a 2.7% chance each at the number 1 overall pick. The bottom 3 teams are now going to be considered the relegation zone. That's what they're going to be called. And now they're going to essentially be penalized. They're only going to have 2 lottery balls, which, as I said, is a 5.4% chance at the number 1 overall pick in the NBA draft. This is going to try to prevent teams from tanking on purpose. And then you'll have the teams that have the 4th worst record to the 10th worst record. they're going to have an 8.1% chance at the number one pick. They're each going to have 3 lottery balls, which is very much an upgrade from what it was before. And then play-in teams are going to have 2 balls or 1 ball in the lottery. Teams that fall out of the play-in tournament are going to have 2 lottery balls, which will end up being a 5.4% chance at the number one overall pick for the 9th and the 10th seeds. And then for the losers of the 7 versus 8 play-in games, they're going to have a 2.7% chance at the number one pick, and they're going to have 1 draft lottery ball. The NBA is also going to have some disciplinary ability over these teams, and this is a quote from the NBA website. The league will have expanded disciplinary authority to address tanking, including the ability to reduce teams' lottery odds, modify teams' draft positions, and impose significant fines on offending teams. At the end of the day, this very much, in my opinion, is an aggressive approach by the league, but something had to be done, and it's unfortunate that it had to come to this point where the league had to do something so aggressive and harsh to some of these teams that fall in the bottom 3 or bottom 5 worst records in the NBA. But something had to be done at the end of the day. And now I'm going to break down some pros and cons before I give my opinion. Some pros from this new proposal. And like I said, this was now approved from the NBA Board of Governors. So this will be going into place for the 2027, 2028, and 2029 drafts. And then for 2030, they'll address it and circle back on this proposal and see if it should continue in the future. But here are some pros from this new system. This is now going to incentivize teams in the bottom 10 in the NBA to try to fight to make the play-in tournament rather than tank for a higher pick. Another pro is that this is going to prevent hardcore tanking like we saw this past season, or like I said, this current season from the 2025-2026 season, the season that is still ongoing, but the regular season is now over with. There was a lot of hardcore tanking that we saw, blatant tanking from teams. We saw 10 teams finish the 25-26 regular season with a win percentage under 400. We also saw 8 teams finish with an under 333 win percentage. We saw teams like Dallas and Indiana trying to take a gap year from competing due to injuries to stars such as Tyrese Halliburton and Kyrie Irving. That is very much something the NBA wants to change, and that's why they're doing this new system. We will likely not see teams have 2 to 3 year windows anymore where they're actively tanking and planning to tank. We saw that with Brooklyn, Utah, and Washington over the last few seasons. We won't see that be the case probably as much in the future, or if at all. And we also won't see teams try to tank like Philadelphia did during the Sam Hinkie era back in, I think it was around 2013 to about 2016 or 2017. Philadelphia was blatantly tanking for 3 to 4 years to get top draft picks, which led to them tanking in receiving 3 top 3 picks, landing Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, and Markelle Fultz in 3 different drafts. We won't see that probably be the case anymore due to this new anti-tanking system. Teams are very much disincentivized from tanking. And one of the pros is that from this 3-2-1 lottery that, like I said, is now going to be in effect for the 2027, 28, and 29 NBA drafts, this gives the NBA a chance to revisit this idea in a few years to make additional changes or revert back to the way things were if teams are less focused on tanking and the NBA Board of Governors at that point in 2030 think it's an okay idea to go back to the way things were. I think this is a good idea for the league to not have this be a permanent thing and give it a 3-year window to see how things go. That way they can circle back on it, and if it ends up being something that they should address again or change, it gives the NBA some leeway to make those given and needed changes. Now for some cons from this system. I think the main thing is about where draft picks fall. Picks that are traded or were traded are now essentially restricted in some ways because now they have a change in value. For example, Utah traded a 2027 first-round pick to Memphis, and that was their own first-round pick in 2027. They traded to Memphis in a package for Jaren Jackson Jr., and now that Utah first-round pick cannot be in the top 5 for the 2027 NBA draft, and that's because one stipulation from this system is that a team cannot have 3 consecutive years with a top 5 pick, and Utah has now had a top 5 pick in 2 straight years. So now that changes the value of that pick. Now that pick, the highest it can fall is 6th overall. So at the end of the day, that's very much why the Memphis Grizzlies were against this new system, because now that draft pick that they traded for, that they thought was going to maybe fall in the top 5 next year, is no longer going to be as valuable. I think when Utah made that trade, obviously no one knew that this was going to be the new system and this new policy in the NBA. But I think Utah, when they traded that pick for Jaren Jackson Jr., they assumed that they would have a top 5 pick in this year's draft and be ready to contend or take that next step to competing in the Western Conference. And that's why they were probably fine with giving up their 2027 first-round pick in a trade with Memphis. Another con, and this somewhat coincides with the last con I just talked about, is that with how random the draft lottery is now going to be, draft picks are now going to have less value. They're going to be harder to predict where a pick will end up, which I consider a con when it comes to trading for a star at the end of the day, because in the past, a lot of teams in there trading their superstar franchise player, they want draft picks back in return that they know are probably going to fall maybe in the top 5, maybe in the top 10 in years to come. When you're trading picks 6 or 7 years down the line, you're banking on a franchise not being in a position to contend 7 years down the line when this franchise-altering player is no longer the same player or no longer on this team's roster. Those draft picks 6 years down the line were a lot more valuable. Now, it's not as valuable because at the end of the day, for example, the Utah Jazz, let's say this season goes awry and they struggle, their pick in 2027 is owned by the Memphis Grizzlies. So they know now, at the end of the day, Utah knows they can no longer have a top 5 pick for 3 consecutive years, obviously. So now in 2027, that pick cannot be in the top 5. And they also know that this pick isn't owned by them. So they don't really care about tanking and losing on purpose. They can try to win games. But it could also go the reverse way, where a team that isn't in the same position as Utah, they haven't had a top 5 pick in 3 consecutive drafts, or haven't had it in 2 consecutive drafts and are in danger of having it for a 3rd consecutive draft, teams could openly not lose games, but maybe towards the end of the season, not tank, but try to hurt the team they traded with. So for example, just give an example here. Let's say Utah didn't have 2 consecutive years with a top 5 pick. So let's say they didn't have a top 5 pick in 2025 and 2026. That 2027 draft pick that is traded from Utah, a first-round pick from Utah going to Memphis, now that draft pick owned by Memphis, Utah could say, hey, we didn't have the year we were expecting to. Now it's owned by the Memphis Grizzlies. We know that at the end of the day, falling in the bottom 3 is going to hurt Memphis, because now Memphis knows they're really banking on Utah falling 4 through 10 because they really want that pick to have a chance, or the highest chance, at the number 1 overall pick. But if Utah isn't taking on purpose, because at the end of the day, it's not going to help themselves. It's not going to help themselves by taking on purpose because they don't own their own draft pick, and now it's a whole new system. But if Utah has a bottom 3 record, they know at the end of the day, they're giving the Memphis Grizzlies a very small percentage chance, just a 5.4% chance at the number 1 overall pick. Compared to, in the past, the team that finished with the worst record had a 14% chance at the number 1 pick. So I think that's going to change the way draft picks are valued in the NBA. It's also going to change the way some teams maybe approach the end of the season when, if they don't own their draft pick, they're not openly tanking anymore because they're not going to get hurt by it. They're not hurting their own draft status. But they could at the same time, while losing games, while not trying to openly throw games, but they are losing games at the end of the season and they're not hurting their own draft stock. They're hurting the team they traded with, and they don't care at the end of the day when that happens, because that team that they traded with, made that risk and that gamble with the hope that that draft pick would end up with them having as high of a pick as possible with the most value. And I know I just rambled about that. I'm not sure if it all even makes sense what I just said at the end of the day. Hopefully what I was trying to say translates well to any of the listeners out there, and I do appreciate you guys listening as always, so thank you for tuning in. But I do think, and back to my original second con here that I want to mention, draft picks are going to have less value. They're going to be harder to predict where they're going to end up, which I consider a con when it comes to teams that are trading a star and wanting draft picks in return. And per the NBA website, and this is a quote, "These restrictions will only apply to each team's own pick without regard to whether that pick has been retained by the team or traded and thus held by another team." And that's in the case of the Memphis Grizzlies and the Utah Jazz that I just talked about. Another con is that bottom 3 records will pick 12th at worst. And like I said, they're going to be now known as a relegated team in some regards. That's what they're going to call it, a relegated team, essentially, in this new policy. I think this is a little bit harsh, though, that bottom three teams have a chance at the 12th overall pick. What if a team had some bad injury luck and had some players truly underperform? I think it's a little bit harsh, but I know why the NBA did it. And now for my opinion, I respect the NBA for trying to address the tanking culture of the league because it has gotten out of hand the last few years, especially this current regular season that just happened. But I don't think teams in the bottom three should have the same chance at the number 1 overall pick as the number 9 and number 10 play-in teams. I think that's just a little bit too aggressive. But like I said, I can't fault the league for trying to punish teams that are tanking. What if a team just had some bad injury luck or is a younger team? This may now cause some teams to build their roster differently and aim to be more in the middle of the pack of the lottery. And maybe certain teams will now buy at the trade deadline a little bit more than they would have in years past. And we saw Utah do that at the deadline this past year, trading for Jaren Jackson Jr. I think this new policy is going to motivate teams to no longer fully tank for a full season, as we saw this past year with Sacramento, Washington, Brooklyn, and Utah, to name a few teams. But there were more teams than that trying to openly tank this past season. Brooklyn, Utah, and Indiana were likely planning on tanking this past regular season, in the 2025-2026 regular season. They were probably planning that since last summer. So overall, I do think this new policy is going to solve most of, if not all of the league's tanking issues. I would say most, probably not all, but most of the league's tanking issues. But I do think it's a pretty harsh and aggressive approach by the league, since some teams may genuinely just have injury issues to stop players, and that bad luck will cause them to fall in their draft odds. However, this will stop teams from blatantly tanking, though, which is the goal of this new policy. And this will stop teams from tanking over a 2 or 3 year window. We'll see now rebuilding teams are going to now to look to compete more now than they have in the past few seasons. And we'll see that now towards the end of the regular season, too. Teams trying to win games at the end of the regular season to get within that 4th to the 10th place finish with the worst record rather than being a bottom 3 team, since bottom 3 teams are now have, less of a chance at the number 1 pick. With the odds being the same for teams that finish with the 4th worst record through the 10th worst record, there is no benefit to losing on purpose towards the end of the regular season anymore. The economics of losing are no longer as attractive as they once were in past NBA draft lotteries, and that's now because of how random the 2027 NBA draft lottery is going to be. And now how the bottom 3 teams in 2027, 2028, and 2029 are going to have drastically lessened odds. And like I noted, this is now going to hurt the value of draft picks. Now draft picks, they were already a roll of the dice and unpredictable, but now they're going to be even more unpredictable, and I think that's going to hurt the value of them in trades. And this will now change the way teams approach trading draft picks, trading at the trade deadline, maybe even change the way they have their current roster built. Maybe a team like Brooklyn, who is planning on tanking for another season, maybe they say, you know what, we don't want to continue tanking on purpose. If they are tanking on purpose, who knows at the end of the day, but it seems like a lot of teams are openly tanking. But maybe a team like Brooklyn, who is planning on maybe taking another year of a rebuild, maybe they change that approach because they want to fall between the 4th and the 10th worst records and no longer want to be in the bottom 3 next year to have the best chance of the number 1 overall pick. I do think in the last month of the regular season next year for the 2026-2027 regular season, we're going to see the bottom 5 to 8 teams looking to win more games, which is going to make the end of the regular season more fascinating to watch. I went to a game at the end of this past regular season in March of 2026. I went to a Sacramento Kings game against the Brooklyn Nets at the Barclays Center. In that game, Russell Westbrook, Malik Monk, Domantas Sabonis, Zach LaVine, all of those guys were out. DeMar DeRozan as well. And then you look at the other side in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Nets had Michael Porter Jr. out. And we saw games at the end of the regular season in Washington, Trae Young, Anthony Davis out. We saw in Utah, Jaren Jackson Jr., Lauri Markkanen, all out towards the end of the regular season. We saw teams that were up in the 4th quarter, the Utah Jazz, taking starters out on purpose with a lead so that they could potentially lose the game in the last 5 to 8 minutes of the game and give themselves a chance at a higher draft pick because now they have another loss in the loss column and fall lower in the NBA in win percentage and then thus would have a better chance at the number 1 overall pick. I think we're not going to see that as much with this new proposal, and that's why I think this new proposal, although, like I said, is harsh and aggressive, something had to be done. So I respect the NBA for this, and I do think this is going to solve most of the NBA's tanking issues, and it's going to make the end of the NBA regular season not a novel of injury reports with players that are just sitting out just to sit out, essentially. We won't see that as much, and that will be better for fans as well. I went to that game in Brooklyn with the hope of seeing DeMar DeRozan playing Russell Westbrook. At the end of the day, both of those guys were out, unfortunately, but there are fans that are paying money to go to all of these regular season games in the NBA, and if teams are openly sitting guys or taking guys out of the games on purpose, that's not right to the fans at the end of the day that are spending money and going to these games to try to see those players play. So I do think this new approach by the league, though aggressive, is going to address and solve some of these issues in the league regarding tanking. And we'll see how this ends up changing the way teams approach roster building. I do think there's going to be a change with the way draft picks are traded and how much they're valued in trades, because now things are a lot more random. But I do think this is a positive thing for the league. Although it is aggressive and harsh, I think, and I do think there are some things that I would change with it personally. Like, I don't think the bottom 3 teams should have the same draft odds at the number 1 overall pick as the 2 play-in teams that are the 9 versus 10 teams in the play-in. But I do know at the end of the day, something had to change. And it's unfortunate that over the last 2 or 3 years, teams that were openly tanking forced the NBA's hand to have a drastic change and a new proposal like this. But something had to be done, and we'll see how things work out. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.